My son-in-law left a voicemail on a Tuesday afternoon. Calm voice, almost polite. He said I was no longer welcome in my daughter's home, that my presence was making her anxious, and that I should make other arrangements. I listened to that message 3 times, standing in my kitchen in Kelowna, holding a mug of coffee that had gone completely cold. Then I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt more than anything had in years. I smiled because I recognized the moment. After 34 years of managing commercial properties across British Columbia, you learn to read the exact second when a negotiation stops being about compromise and starts being about who owns what. This was that second. My name is Douglas Mercer. I'm 69 years old. I spent my career in property management, mostly in the Okanagan. Retired at 65 with a clean portfolio and a reputation I was proud of. My wife, Patricia, passed from ovarian cancer 8 years ago. And after that, it was just me and my daughter, Vanessa, who had always been the sharpest, funniest person in any room she walked into. Or she used to be anyway. Before she married Derek. I want to be fair here. Derek wasn't a monster when he first came around. He was 31, confident, worked in sales for a solar energy company in Kelowna, talked a lot about growth and opportunity and the kind of future he was building. Vanessa brought him to Thanksgiving dinner 4 years ago, and he spent 2 hours asking me thoughtful questions about real estate and investment and listening carefully to my answers. I remember thinking, this one actually has some depth to him. I was wrong. He wasn't interested in my ideas. He was appraising what I had. They moved fast, engaged within 8 months, married the following June in a ceremony at a vineyard outside of West Kelowna. Vanessa wore her grandmother's earrings. I cried, and I'm not ashamed of it. I thought I was watching my daughter begin something real and good. 6 months after the wedding, Derek's sales position evaporated when his company downsized, and Vanessa called to ask if they could temporarily move into my house on Abbott Street while they sorted out their finances. She said 3 months, maybe 4. I said yes without a second thought. That was 2.5 years ago. The first year, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Derek was job hunting, he said, but the right opportunity hadn't materialized yet. He was selective, he explained, because taking just anything would set back his career trajectory. Vanessa was working as a dental hygienist, pulling in maybe $58,000 a year before tax, and Derek had some contract work here and there that he described vaguely as consulting. I never saw evidence of what he was consulting on. What I did see was the new truck in my driveway, a $60,000 GMC Sierra 1500 that they'd financed. I saw the weekend trips to Vancouver and Whistler that showed up on Vanessa's Instagram. I saw the grocery bills double, even though I was doing most of the cooking. I want to say something about that time that I haven't told many people. The hardest part wasn't the money. Money I could absorb. The hardest part was watching my daughter slowly become someone I didn't recognize. Patricia and I had raised a woman who said thank you and meant it, who called just to check in, who used to sit with me in the backyard and talk for hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. That woman started disappearing in small ways. She stopped asking how I was doing. She stopped suggesting we watch hockey together on Friday nights like we used to. When I walked into a room where she and Derek were talking, the conversation would just end. Not awkwardly, deliberately. The comments started around month 8 of them living there. Always from Derek. Always wrapped in something that sounded like concern. Doug, have you thought about getting those stairs looked at? Loose railing is a liability, especially as you get older. Or I ran into your neighbor Brian. He mentioned you seemed confused about the recycling schedule last week. Everything all right with your memory? He never said anything directly cruel, not at first. He was surgical. He planted these small seeds of doubt in every room, and I could see them taking root in Vanessa's expression, the way she'd nod slightly when he said these things, the way she stopped disagreeing with him. I'm a practical man. I've spent my whole career reading people and situations, and I knew what Derek was doing even as he was doing it. But knowing something and acting on it are different things when it's your own family involved. I kept waiting for Vanessa to find her way back to herself. I kept giving her chances to push back, to say something, to be the person I knew she still was somewhere underneath what was happening. She didn't. And I kept excusing it because she was my daughter and I loved her. and some part of me believed that patience would eventually matter. The real shift came 5 months ago. I'd been seeing a woman named Carol, a retired school teacher from Penticton. I'd met through a hiking group. We'd been having coffee for a few months, then dinner, then long drives up to Noramata to walk the bench trails and talk about everything we'd both missed while we were raising families and building careers. Carol made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. She was sharp and warm and completely unimpressed by things that were supposed to impress people, which I found deeply attractive. I mentioned Carol at dinner one evening. Derek's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Vanessa looked at the table. Derek set down his fork very carefully and said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a child, "Dad, I don't think you understand how that kind of thing looks at your age. People are going to take advantage of you. There are women out there who specifically target widowers with assets." I told him I was 69, not confused, and that Carol was a retired teacher, not a grifter. He smiled and said he was just trying to protect me. 2 weeks later, I asked if Carol could come for Sunday dinner. Just the 4 of us, nothing formal, I just wanted the people in my life to know each other. Derek said no before I'd finished the sentence. He said Vanessa wasn't comfortable with strangers in the house. I pointed out it was my house. He said that after 2.5 years, they'd built a life here, and that I needed to respect that. Vanessa said nothing. She was looking at her wine glass. I went for a drive after that. Long one, out toward Peachland, windows down, watching the lake go silver in the evening light. I called Carol from a pullout on the highway and told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I valued most about her, then said quietly that I deserved better than what I was accepting. I already knew it. I'd known it for a while, but hearing it out loud from someone who had no stake in the situation made something settle in me. That night, I came home to find my workshop in the detached garage reorganized without my permission. I kept my woodworking tools in there, a hobby I'd had for 20 years. I made small pieces of furniture, nothing fancy, mostly repairs and simple builds. Derek had moved my workbench to make room for his hockey equipment and what looked like a half-assembled home gym he'd ordered online. I stood in the door of that garage for a long time. Then I went inside and texted my brother-in-law, Victor Healy, who'd been a real estate lawyer in Kamloops for 30 years. Just 3 words. Call me tomorrow. Victor called me at 7:30 the next morning. I explained the situation. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Doug, how long have you been meaning to do something about this?" I said I wasn't sure, but I was sure now. He said, "Come in Friday and bring everything." His office in Kamloops had that particular quality of a place that has always done serious things seriouslings. We sat across a big oak desk for 3 hours going through documents I'd been quietly updating for the last 18 months. Not because I'd anticipated this specific moment, but because I'd watched enough families blow apart over property to know you kept your affairs in order. The house on Abbott Street was mine alone, purchased in 1998 for $340,000, now assessed at just under $1,000,001. The title had never changed. All utilities, taxes, home insurance, maintenance costs. Douglas Mercer, sole account holder. Victor reviewed everything, looked up and said, "You've done your homework." I said I'd had time. We drafted a formal notice requiring payment of market rent or vacation of the premises within 60 days. Victor explained the process under British Columbia's Residential Tenancy Act, which gave clear legal standing to a property owner who had never established a formal lease, had provided notice, and had documented sole ownership. He noted that without a written agreement, they had no legal tenancy rights beyond what the notice period provided. I asked him to prepare the notice for courier delivery the following Monday. Then I drove home and acted like nothing had happened for the rest of the weekend. Monday morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table reading the paper, which I did every single day of my life and which Derek had called old-fashioned approximately 20 times over the past 2 years. He came downstairs at 8:15 and told me good morning with the particular vagueness of someone who doesn't really mean it. I said good morning back. The courier knocked at 11:45. I wasn't there when they opened it. I'd driven to Carol's place in Penticton and we were sitting on her front porch eating lunch when my phone started ringing. Vanessa first, then Derek, then Vanessa again, then a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Derek calling from a friend's phone, which told me everything I needed to know about how he was feeling. I watched the calls come in and kept eating my sandwich. Carol asked what was happening. I told her I'd sent a notice requiring them to either start paying market rent, $2,200 a month, which was below current Kelowna rates, or vacate within 60 days. She set down her fork. And if they can't pay, I said their combined income, being Vanessa's salary and whatever Derek pulled in from his consulting arrangements, was probably around $70,000 a year before tax. After the truck payments, credit card balances, and the lifestyle they've been running on my subsidy, adding $2,200 in rent would break the math. They'd have to move. Carol said, "Good. I've been waiting for someone to say that." I answered on the 14th missed call. Vanessa's voice hit a register I hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager. "How could you do this? How could you just send a letter after everything? After we've been here 2.5 years and built a life here, and you've never said anything was wrong." I waited until she ran out of breath. Then I said, "I've said something was wrong many times, Vanessa. You chose not to hear it." She said that was not fair. I said fair was a market rate for the house you've been living in for free. Derek got on the line almost immediately. "This is harassment," he said. "You cannot do this legally." I told him he was welcome to review the Residential Tenancy Act of British Columbia, specifically the sections on month-to-month occupancy and proper written notice. He went quiet. I hung up. I started moving my things out 2 days later. Not all of it, just the things that mattered. My tools moved back to the garage and then out of it into a storage unit I'd rented. My father's watch collection wrapped and boxed. Patricia's photos off the walls. My woodworking projects, finished and unfinished, loaded into my truck carefully. I'd arranged to rent a 1-bedroom suite in the newer building off Gordon Drive, 1,100 square feet, bright kitchen, underground parking. Mine. Completely mine, with no one moving my workbench or asking pointed questions about whether I'd remembered to lock the back door. My son came out while I was loading boxes. I should clarify. Derek was never my son. But Vanessa looked at me from the living room window and I waited for her to come outside and she didn't. That was the moment that cost me the most. Not the money, not the 2.5 years of subsidized entitlement, not the reorganized garage. The moment my daughter watched me load my own belongings into my truck and stayed inside. Derek did come out. He tried reasonable first. He said they'd been blindsided, said the 60-day notice wasn't enough time given the rental market, said they had no savings because they'd been planning to stay long-term. I said they'd had 2.5 years to build savings and their monthly expenses had been around $600 for utilities and groceries they didn't replace, so I wasn't sure where the money had gone. He flushed and said that wasn't my business. I said it became my business when the money they should have been saving was being spent on Whistler weekends and a truck they couldn't afford, while they were living in my house for free. He shifted to threatening. Said he'd talked to a lawyer, said there were provisions that protected long-term occupants. Said the court in BC would look at this differently than I thought. I told him I'd already spoken to a real estate lawyer with 30 years of BC practice, that the documentation was airtight, and that if he wanted to contest the notice, he was welcome to do so through the residential tenancy branch, where the outcome would be the same but with a formal record of proceedings. He went back inside. I kept loading boxes. The apartment was quiet in a way that the house had stopped being. I unpacked slowly and arranged things the way I wanted them, which sounds like a small thing, but isn't when you've spent 2 years feeling like a guest in your own home. I set Patricia's photo on the bookshelf. I put my father's watches in the display case I built for them 20 years ago. I fell asleep on the first night without the low-grade tension I'd been carrying in my chest for so long, I'd almost stopped noticing it. Victor called a week after delivery. They filed a dispute with the residential tenancy branch, he said, claiming improper notice and arguing that the length of occupancy established a de facto tenancy with additional rights. I said, "Is that going to work?" He said no. The notice was correctly served under the Act. Their occupancy had never been formalized, and I had documentation showing the arrangement was always understood to be temporary. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. I also made one other call that week. I had co-signed a personal loan for Derek 2 years earlier. $34,000, he said, was for a business opportunity that had never materialized into anything I could identify. I contacted my credit union, explained the change in circumstances, and initiated the process to formally withdraw as co-signer. The loan officer told me that based on Derek's income profile, without my backing, the loan would require reassessment. I said I understood. I said to proceed. Derek posted on Facebook before the hearing. He didn't name me, but anyone who knew us knew exactly who he was describing. Long post about elder exploitation, about parents using financial control to manipulate adult children, about how his family was facing homelessness because of someone's pride and vindictiveness. The post got shared in a Kelowna community group. Some people commented sympathetically. Some people asked questions he couldn't answer cleanly. A former colleague of mine named Pauline, who'd worked in property management for 20 years, left a comment that said simply, "I've known Douglas Mercer for 15 years. If you're in his house, he put you there. If he's asking you to leave, there's a reason." That comment got more responses than his original post. I didn't look at social media much after that. I had a hearing to prepare for and a life to rebuild. And both of those things mattered more than what strangers in a Facebook group thought about my character. The residential tenancy branch hearing was held at a government office in downtown Kelowna on a Thursday morning. Victor attended with me. Derek and Vanessa brought a paralegal they'd found through a legal aid referral. The adjudicator, a precise woman in her mid-50s, reviewed the documentation and asked each party a series of methodical questions. Derek's argument came down to this. They'd lived there long enough that moving them out amounted to undue hardship, and I hadn't given them enough time to make alternative arrangements. The adjudicator asked if there was a written lease. There wasn't. She asked if there was any documentation showing they had a right to occupy beyond the permission of the owner. There wasn't. She asked if they had made any financial contributions to the property, mortgage payments, taxes, insurance. They hadn't. She asked Vanessa directly, "Did you understand at any point that this living arrangement was permanent and unconditional?" Vanessa looked at Derek, then at the table. Then she said, "We thought it would be long-term." The adjudicator said, "That's different from having a legal right to it." She ruled in my favor. 60 days stood. Derek went very still. Vanessa started crying quietly, in a way that looked genuine, and I had to look at the wall to keep my composure. Outside the building, Victor shook my hand and said it was as clear-cut as he'd expected. I thanked him. He said, "Let me know when you're ready to list the property." I said I was already thinking about it. 3 weeks before the end of their notice period, I received a letter from my credit union. Derek's loan reassessment had come back. Without my income and assets as collateral, he didn't qualify for the existing terms. The credit union was offering him 2 options. Find a new co-signer who met qualification criteria, or arrange to pay the outstanding balance of $29,000 within 30 days. A third option existed but wasn't being offered as a choice: default, collections, and a significant mark on his credit rating. I knew Derek's parents. His father worked maintenance at a resort in Vernon. His mother did part-time bookkeeping. They didn't have $29,000 sitting around, and even if they did, co-signing a loan for a son whose finances were already in collapse would be a significant risk. I felt no pleasure knowing this, or I told myself I didn't. I felt the same clean satisfaction I used to feel when a complicated property negotiation closed correctly. Not joy, just the sense of things being where they ought to be. Derek showed up at my apartment on a Saturday afternoon. I saw him through the peephole. He looked like a man who'd been awake for too many nights. I waited a breath, then opened the door. He didn't try charm. He said, "The loan is being called." "You did that." I didn't deny it. He said, "You're trying to destroy us." I said, "I'm trying to recover something that should never have been put at risk." He said, "We don't have that kind of money." "I know," I said. "You've been living on credit and my goodwill for 2.5 years, and you spent the money that should have been savings on a truck and weekend trips. That's not something I did to you. That's something you did to yourselves." He changed tone then, softened, tried a different approach. He talked about Vanessa, about how she was struggling, about how she was struggling, about how stress was affecting her health. He said she cried every night. He said she needed her father and I was choosing property over my own daughter. I let him finish. Then I said, I haven't chosen property over Vanessa. Vanessa chose Derek's comfort over her own judgment. She stood at that window while I loaded my belongings into my truck and she stayed inside. That was her choice. I'm still her father. But being her father doesn't mean being a resource to be managed. He left. I stood at my window and watched his truck pull out of the parking lot. The GMC Sierra. $60,000 of financing that was about to become a lot more complicated. Carol came by that evening. She'd brought wine and the ingredients for pasta, and she pretended not to notice that I was quieter than usual, which was one of her gifts. We cooked together and ate at my small kitchen table, and I told her about Derek's visit. She listened. Then she said, You know this isn't over yet. I said no, but I'm not afraid of what's left. She was right that it wasn't over. 2 weeks before the deadline, Vanessa called me. Not screaming, not threatening, just her voice, tired in a way that made her sound like she was 60 years old instead of 34. Dad, she said, I know I haven't handled this well. I know Derek has said things that weren't okay, and I know I should have said something, and I didn't. I'm not asking you to take everything back. I just want you to know I'm sorry. And I miss you. I held the phone for a long moment. I said, I miss you too, Vanessa. I've been missing you for 1.5 years while you were living 20 feet away. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I said, You need to work through this, both of you. And when you're on the other side of it, when you've lived your own life with your own money for a while and had time to think, I want to hear from you. But that conversation has to happen when you're standing on your own feet. She said, Is that your way of saying it's not happening today? I said, It's my way of saying I love you and I'm not going away, but I'm not coming back to what was. She said she understood. They moved out 9 days before the deadline. I received a text from Vanessa saying they'd left the keys under the mat and she was sorry about some scratches on the kitchen floor. I drove by the house the following morning, let myself in, walked through the room slowly. The master bedroom closet had been stripped. The garage had Derek's equipment ghost shapes in the dust where it used to sit. The kitchen had 3 small scratches near the island that would cost maybe $400 to refinish. That was all. They left it reasonably clean, which surprised me, and I chose to take that as something. I met with a realtor the following week. My neighbor Brian had mentioned the market was still strong in Kelowna's core, and the property had appreciated significantly since the late 90s. The realtor walked through, did her assessment, and came back with a figure that made me sit down, asking around $1,050,000, likely to attract quick interest. I listed it within the month. A young couple, both engineers at a tech firm that had established a Kelowna office, came through on a Saturday, made an offer by Monday. Firm sale at $1,020,000, closing in 45 days. After the remaining mortgage and costs, I was looking at net proceeds that gave me more freedom than I'd had in a decade. I used a portion of it to buy a 2-bedroom condominium on the waterfront in Penticton, half an hour from Carroll. A workshop space in the building's common room where I could get back to the woodworking I'd let slide. A deck facing Okanagan Lake, where the evening light came in, horizontal and gold in the summer. The kind of light that makes everything feel slower and more possible. It was the first property I'd owned that felt chosen rather than accumulated. I moved in during the first week of October and spent a weekend hanging pictures and arranging the workshop the exact way I wanted it, and no one moved anything. Victor called 2 months after the hearing to tell me Derek's loan had gone to default. He hadn't found a co-signor and hadn't been able to pay the balance. Collections had been engaged. His credit rating had been significantly damaged. The GMC Sierra had been voluntarily surrendered before repossession, which showed some practical sense at least. Derek and Vanessa were renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Rutland, on the east side of Kelowna, for $1,600 a month, which they were managing on Vanessa's salary while Derek looked for full-time work again. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I want to be honest about this because it would be easy to perform some kind of satisfaction that wasn't really there. What I felt was something more like grief moving through the last stage. The relief of watching a thing finally be what it was going to be instead of holding my breath waiting for it. Vanessa texted me in November. Just a photo, Her and a friend hiking at Manning Park, snow on the distant peaks, both of them red-cheeked and grinning. No caption. I looked at it for a long time. Then I sent back, "Beautiful day." She wrote, "Yeah." And that was it for then. But she sent it. That was the thing, she sent it. Carol and I spent Christmas with her daughter's family in Victoria. Ferry over from Sawasan, 4 days of wet coast winter and good red wine, and arguments about hockey standings that everyone enjoyed more than they'd admit. On Christmas morning I sat with Carol's 7-year-old grandson, who wanted to show me everything he'd gotten, and couldn't get the words out fast enough. And I thought about Vanessa at that age. The way she'd wake me up at 6 in the morning and drag me down the stairs, and Patricia would be there already with coffee, because she'd never been able to sleep in either. And the three of us would sit in the early dark with the tree lights going and the day still ahead of us. And it was enough. It was more than enough. I'm not writing this as a story about winning. I want to be clear about that. I'm writing it because I spent almost 3 years slowly disappearing from my own life. One small accommodation at a time, one excused comment at a time. And the moment I stopped was the moment I began to understand that love is not the same thing as availability. You can love your daughter without being a floor she walks on. You can love your child without funding a life she's built with someone who treats your kindness as something owed. The last thing Vanessa said to me before the holidays, in a longer text she sent late on a Sunday night, was, "I understand now what you were protecting. I'm trying to understand how I let it happen. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it." I wrote back, "That's enough. That's more than enough. We have time, and we do, because I'm 69 years old and I wake up in the morning in a place that is mine, entirely mine, and I look at the lake and I drink my coffee and I go to the workshop and I build something with my hands. And some evenings Carol comes by and we cook and argue about books, and she beats me at cribbage every single time, and my daughter is out there finding her way back to herself, and I'm not waiting for her to arrive. I'm already here. That turns out to be the only thing I needed to know. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the hearing, not the day I loaded my truck, not even that voicemail. It's the image of Vanessa standing at the window while I carried boxes to my truck. Just standing there, and I think about what it costs a person to do that, to watch their father pack up his life and not walk outside. Whatever Derek had built inside her over those 2.5 years, it had gotten deep enough to hold her still at that window. That's not weakness I'm angry at anymore. That's something I grieve. I spent a long time asking myself where I went wrong, whether I should have spoken up sooner, drawn a line earlier, said something the first time Derek made one of his careful little comments about my memory, my stares, my age. I don't have a clean answer. What I know is that I kept choosing patience when patience had already run its course. There's a version of patience that's a virtue and a version that's just avoidance wearing a quieter name. I was living in the second version for most of those 2.5 years. What finally moved me wasn't anger. It was clarity. The night I stood in my own garage and looked at where Derek had moved my workbench. My workbench, in my garage in my house. Something settled. Not rage, just recognition. I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew I'd been letting it happen, and I understood in that moment that letting it continue wasn't kindness to anyone. Not to Vanessa, not to myself, and honestly not even to Derek, who had never once been asked to face a real consequence for how he treated people. That's the thing about enabling someone's worst behavior. You tell yourself you're keeping the peace, but what you're actually doing is building a person who doesn't know how to function when the ground shifts. Derek had never needed to develop the kind of character that holds up under pressure because I'd been absorbing the pressure for him. That's not generosity. That's its own kind of harm. I think about what it actually takes to turn a situation like that around. It's not just the legal notices and the lawyer's office and the documentation, though all of that matters, and you have to be smart enough to use the systems available to you. It's something underneath that. It's being honest enough with yourself to name what's happening without flinching. It's having the judgment to understand the difference between a problem that patience can solve and a problem that patience is making worse. And it's finding the backbone to act on what you know, even when the person you're protecting yourself from is someone you love. Those three things, the honesty, the judgment, the will to act, they didn't come from nowhere. I'd spent 34 years in property management learning to read situations clearly and move on them decisively. I'd learned from Patricia what it looked like to face hard things with your integrity intact. I'd built enough of a life that I knew what I was worth and what I wasn't willing to trade it for. Vanessa is finding her way, slowly in small texts and a photo from Manning Park with snow on the peaks and color in her cheeks. I don't know what her marriage looks like right now or how much of it survives. That's hers to sort out. What I know is that she called me Dad when she apologized. Not Douglas, not some careful formal name, just Dad. And that matters more to me than I'd like to admit. I'm 69 years old and I wake up in the morning in a place that belongs to me. That turns out to be enough. More than enough.